Today we're going to find out what the most secure and private Linux distros are. But the twist is, we'll find out if they're good for you to use. Just because they're the most private doesn't mean they're usable. Stay right there and find out. A GNU Linux OS is the only way to get super security and privacy on the internet. And there are several options, but the question that we will answer later, if this is actually something you can use as an average user. That will become apparent as you see how each works. Make sure to watch the video to the end because I often have a twist in my videos and the conclusion may not be what you expect. There are three popular distros I will focus on first as they're the most well-known and definitely made for security and privacy. These are Tails, Whonix, and Qubes. These three distros are great. They're ultra secure. However, they're not always so usable. If you're already using one of these three and you're using it well, then congratulations! You're doing a great job on protecting your privacy and security. These three distros work the same way. They use the TOR Relay as the only way to use the internet. This is an absolute thing. This cannot be turned off on these distros. You either use TOR or you don't use the internet. Now, if you don't know what TOR is, watch my video explaining TOR. It is the most private way to access the internet because it anonymizes your computer. In other words, TOR hides your IP address. The problem with TOR is that it is capped at 10 megabits per second at the maximum speed. Depending on the random service you get, you could be jumping back and forth between multiple countries and it could be a lot slower than that. There's also a delay as the connection is first established when it determines your relay route. And finally, the most aggravating issue with TOR is that many websites and platforms think you are evil just by using TOR, and they either block you or give you lots of CAPTCHA codes. As I said, all three, Tails, Whonix, and Qubes, use TOR exclusively. Now, Tails is different because it only works as a live CD or live USB. This means that you cannot install it on a computer's hard drive. The result of this is that the OS has no persistence. It doesn't write to files. All your settings, including Wi-Fi connections, word processing files, document, notes, will be erased the moment you end your session. This is super cool for spies since they just carry a Tails USB in their pocket and they can access the internet on any computer that allows booting by USB. And if they're caught with the USB, there will be no data on it, nor will there be any trace on the host computer. Unfortunately, this is also the reason why this is the most unusable distro for normal people with regular devices. For example, I couldn't make videos on it or write a long-term document. So I'd say Tails is something I'd recommend for a spy, but not for everyone else. I don't think Snowden uses Tails, if that's a hint. The next popular privacy distro is Whonix. I've used Whonix a lot. It's actually very practical because it allows part-time use. The way Whonix is installed is that you have to have a host OS, which can be Linux, Windows, or Mac OS. On top of the regular OS, you load virtual machine software, and the one used for Whonix is typically VirtualBox. Virtual machines are basically a way for software to isolate an OS so it's running a separate OS from the host machine. Today, new computers are optimized for virtual machines, so it runs fairly fast even if it has to go from the VM to the host operating system. Whonix runs by creating two virtual machines. One machine acts as your main Whonix desktop, and the second virtual machine acts as a TOR router. If you're running Whonix on a Windows computer, for example, and you're on a browser in Whonix, which by default is a Tor browser, the browser has no idea that you're running it over Windows. Even a website at the other end only sees the session in the Whonix desktop. And it sees the Tor connection. It doesn't see the Windows host or its IP address. That's quite secure. But like Tails, using a Tor-only internet can have limitations. For example, most banks will block Tor, and websites like Netflix will not work with Tor. All the Tor exit nodes will be blacklisted. But with a Whonix desktop, you have a workaround. You can use the host OS Windows in this example temporarily without using Whonix, and this is on the same computer. However, when you use Windows, you are now completely exposed and you will need a VPN at least to hide your IP address. At least you have an option. This is quite a workable solution and you can have the best of both worlds. There are two distinct problems with Whonix. One is that it can be quite difficult to install. I've had computers where I can't get it to work. Often this is because the virtualization features have not been enabled on the computer. You have to set this in the BIOS, and some consumer-made laptops from HP, for example, disable it by default and lock down the BIOS with a password, which they didn't reveal. The second issue when using Whonix is that if the host OS is hacked, which is Windows in my example, then all the hacker has to do is copy the files that has the Whonix virtual machine, and they can start it on their own with your data. One way of hacking it this way is by using the Intel Management Engine, IME. Also, there have been occasional hacks that have occurred where hacking the virtual machine exposes the host OS and its IP address. These likely are fixed now, but it has happened before. The last disadvantage of Whonix is that running on a virtual machine changes the user interface. The mouse moves more slowly, and you have to learn to navigate with different keystrokes to go between the host OS and the Whonix OS. It can get irritating after a while, and it's particularly slower with graphics and video. The third popular distro for privacy is Qubes. Qubes will run better and faster than Whonix because there's no host system that's separate. The virtual machine is built directly into Qubes. This means that you install Qubes as a normal Linux distro from scratch, and that's it. Qubes does have a persistence of data, and it has less layers of complexity than Whonix, so Qubes is much easier to control. I think Snowden uses Qubes. Now, the biggest problem of Qubes is limited compatibility. There are very few devices supported by Qubes, and until recently, it was limited to old computers. I'm happy to say though that the laptops I reviewed in my Linux laptop videos, the new computers, are all compatible with Qubes. But I have to admit that I was so discouraged with Qubes because I tried installing it on a half dozen laptops and it failed on all of them. And the biggest disadvantage with Qubes is that you have to use a different computer if you don't want to use Tor. So this dedicates a computer to one use. There are so many Linux distros. Some are specifically made for cybersecurity professionals, and that is not the class of distros that we are talking about. These distros include Kali and Black Arch Linux, to name a couple. These are made for hackers. By the way, there are other Linux distros that are private as well. They use Tor and have similar capabilities to the ones I mentioned. These include Ipredia and Parrot. These are not as popular. And there are others that have specific limitations like no internet, for example, Discreet Linux. I'm sure I've missed some other special purpose distro, but I haven't installed them, so it doesn't matter. Now, in general, Linux distros are quite a bit more private than Windows or Mac OS. There's no Siri, Cortana, voice spying, there's no telemetry, there's no central authority tracking licenses and upgrades and user accounts and browsing activity. So which of these distros do I recommend? Frankly, after years of using Whonix, I've realized that given the state of the internet, this will not be practical for all. For one, Tor cannot be used with banks and many websites. It's extremely slow. So unless you're doing something particularly covert, you can't easily do daily tasks that normal people do. You always need the option of skipping Tor. Yet it is tempting to want to use the Whonix solution since it does give you the option of using a non-Whonix OS and without rebooting, so you can use it as a part-time solution. But then once I leave Whonix and use my host OS, I still need a privacy solution for web browsing, email, and so on. So I still need to install a VPN over the host OS. And the one thing you don't want to do is run Tor over a VPN. You want to run VPN over Tor, but not the other way around. Just more and more layers of complexity. After trying to teach people how to use Whonix, I had to give up. It doesn't work for most people. And the other problem is that we're not working with a single device anymore. A typical household has multiple computers, multiple phones, and tablets. And we cannot install Linux, and specifically Whonix, on the rest of them. A couple of years ago, I had a brainstorm. Why not duplicate what Whonix does in hardware? My initial solution came in the form of a TOR router, a hardware TOR router, which I've now made into a BraxWifi Router. This is a TOR router like Whonix, but it can also be used as a VPN router for speed. You can find my BraxWifi Router solution on my store at rob.brax.me. Again, I built a solution because I couldn't find an alternative. I built it for myself, and I'm sharing the option with you. So this router basically does what Whonix does, but does it in hardware. The best thing is now that even my phones can use the internet like Whonix. Now, what Linux distro should I use in my computer if I have such a piece of hardware? Well, here's the fun part. Having a hardware solution opens up a lot of new choices, and yet you achieve the same level of privacy because the critical part, the network routing, has been moved to hardware. Then any distro will work fine. For example, I use Ubuntu and Manjaro. By the way, on any Linux distro, you can add the encryption that you will find on Pop! OS and Pure OS. So you don't need those if you want to get privacy and security. You don't necessarily need to install those OSs because you can always add the encryption. Encryption can be installed by itself, for example, using a product called Veracrypt, which is an open source solution. Used to be TrueCrypt. Now, encryption itself is not necessarily an internet privacy solution. It really is more of a physical security solution if you fear someone getting a hold of your computer on site. Maybe we'll cover this in another video. Hope you enjoyed the video and smash that like button if you liked it. And consider subscribing since I do these videos every week and I also do live streams on weekends. Thanks for watching.